My name is Maya Sutton and I was 27 years old, standing in the parking lot of a rundown gas station on the corner of Route 9 and Millfield Road, holding a cashier's check for every dollar I had saved in 6 years, when my father looked at the building and said the most honest thing he had ever said to me. "You are going to lose everything," he said, "and when you do not come crying to us." He said it in front of my mother, in front of my brother Connor, who was leaning against the car with his arms crossed like a man who had already written the ending, in front of Frank Odom, the retired business owner who had spent 3 months mentoring me and who stood beside me that morning with his hands in his jacket pockets and his mouth pressed flat. I looked at my father. I looked at the building. I looked at the check in my hand. Then I walked inside and signed the papers. Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to where this really started. Not to that parking lot. Not to the check. Further back, to a kitchen table where a family sat around a daughter's dream and took turns explaining why it was not going to work. My father Leonard Sutton spent 31 years working the floor of a distribution warehouse in a mid-sized city where ambition was something other people's children had. He was not a cruel man. He was a careful one, which in our house looked almost identical. He believed in the paycheck you could count on and the pension you could see coming and the wisdom of not reaching past what your hands could already hold. He had raised 2 children on those beliefs and he was proud of the results, which is to say he was proud of Connor. Connor was 33 years older than me and had done everything in the correct order. State school, accounting degree, a position at a firm downtown, a girlfriend named Ashley who came to every holiday and never said anything that required a follow-up question. Connor was the one my father pointed to when he wanted to explain what responsible looked like. I was the one he pointed to when he wanted to explain what worried him. I had not done things in the correct order. I had dropped out of business school after 1 year because I was working 2 jobs to pay for it and the math stopped making sense. I had spent 4 years managing a convenience store for a man named Gerald who paid me just enough to keep me from leaving and not enough to let me grow. I had watched Gerald run that store the way you watch someone leave money on the table every single day, understocked shelves, a broken ice machine that sat unrepaired for 8 months, a lottery display that nobody had updated since the previous decade, and I had kept a notebook, not because I had a plan yet, because I could not stop seeing what the place could be if someone ran it like they meant it. My mother Diane was softer than my father but arrived at the same destinations by a different road. She worried in a warm way, with casseroles and phone calls and the specific maternal instinct of a woman who loved her daughter and had decided that protecting her meant talking her out of anything that could go wrong. She had done this with the business school decision. She had done it with the apartment I wanted to rent at 22 that she thought was in a bad neighborhood. She had done it with the used car I bought without asking, the one that turned out to be the most reliable vehicle I have ever owned. She was often wrong and always convinced she was right, and the combination of those 2 things is the most exhausting kind of love there is. My Aunt Vera was my mother's older sister and the only person in my family who had ever built something from scratch. She had run a small alterations and tailoring shop for 22 years in a strip mall 2 towns over. Nothing glamorous, nothing that made the news, but she had put 2 kids through college on it and owned the building outright by the time she was 55, which in our family was something nobody talked about because success in a woman who was not supposed to have it tends to make the people around her uncomfortable. Vera was the one who told me about Frank Odom. Frank had owned 3 convenience stores and a car wash over a 30-year career before selling everything and retiring to consult for people who reminded him of himself when he was starting out. He charged nothing and asked nothing in return except that you actually do the work. He had a list of people waiting to work with him and he chose maybe 1 or 2 a year. Vera had called him on my behalf without telling me, which is the kind of thing only people who actually believe in you do. I met Frank at a diner on a Thursday morning. He ordered black coffee and a slice of pie and spent the first 20 minutes asking me questions I was not ready for. What was the average transaction value at Gerald's store? What was the shrinkage rate? What percentage of revenue came from fuel versus in-store? What the foot traffic patterns looked like on weekday mornings versus weekend afternoons? I answered every question from the notebook I had been keeping for 2 years. He finished his pie. He ordered another cup of coffee. Then he said, "You have been running that store in your head for longer than Gerald has been running it in real life. Let me show you what to do with that." We spent 3 months going through the numbers. Real numbers. Not the fantasy version of owning a business that lives in your head when you are 27 and hopeful, but the actual unsexy architecture of margins and inventory turns and labor costs and fuel contracts. Frank did not sugarcoat anything. He showed me what a gas station that was run well looked like and what one that was run badly looked like and explained, column by column, exactly why the difference between the 2 was almost always a matter of decisions rather than luck. By the time the property on Route 9 came available, I had saved $41,000 over 6 years of working doubles and living in a studio apartment where the radiator hissed all all winter and the upstairs neighbor kept the kind of hours that made sleep a negotiation. $41,000. Not a fortune. Enough, with a small business loan Frank helped me structure, to make the purchase and have a thin operating cushion if I was careful. I told my parents on a Sunday at dinner. The table went quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when everyone is deciding whether to be the first to say the thing they are all thinking. My father spoke first. He asked me how much I had saved. I told him. He asked how much the loan was. I told him. He did a quiet calculation behind his eyes and then said, "You are betting your whole life on a gas station on a road I would not stop on in daylight." My mother reached over and put her hand on mine. "Honey, what if it fails?" She said it the way you would say, "What if the ice is too thin to walk on?" What if being the operative possibility? I told them Frank thought the fundamentals were sound, that the location had traffic patterns that were being underserved, that the previous owner had run it into the ground through neglect, not structural failure, and that neglect was fixable. Connor looked up from his plate. He had been quiet up to that point, which with Connor meant he was preparing something. He set his fork down. "You want to spend everything you have," he said, "on a building that a smarter person gave up on." He said it flatly, the way you would state a math problem, not cruelly, just with the absolute certainty of someone who had never once backed a horse that was not already winning. I said, "The previous owner did not give up on it. He retired and did not have a buyer who understood what it could be." Connor almost smiled. "That is what people say when they overpay for a problem." My father said, "You could lose this and have nothing." At 27. "Do you understand what that means?" I said I understood. He said, "If this goes wrong, we cannot bail you out. We do not have that kind of money." I said I was not asking anyone to bail me out. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said the thing I told you at the beginning. "You are going to lose everything. And when you do not come crying to us." I drove home alone. I sat in my studio apartment with the radiator hissing and my notebook open on the kitchen table, and I did the numbers again. Not because I needed to. Because doing the numbers was the only prayer I knew. The figures said what they had always said. The location was undervalued. The foot traffic was real. The previous owner's neglect was documented and specific and correctable. Frank had walked me through the corrections. The path was narrow, but it was there. I called Frank that night. He answered on the second ring. He said, "What did they say?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The people who believe in you at the beginning are a gift, but the people who do not are not always wrong. They are just measuring the odds. Your job is to change the odds." I asked him if he thought I was making a mistake. He said, "I think you have done more homework on this building than most people do on their marriages. I think the numbers are honest and you understand them. And I think the fear your family is feeling is real even if their conclusion is wrong." He paused. "I also think," he said, "that the worst outcome here is not losing the money. The worst outcome is not trying and spending the next 30 years in Gerald's store wondering what the numbers would have said." I signed the papers on a Tuesday morning in March. My father drove out that day with my mother and Connor in the car. I do not know why they came. Maybe to witness. Maybe to say goodbye to the money in a way that felt official. They stood in the parking lot while I stood with Frank and the seller and the closing attorney, and when I came out with the keys in my hand, my father said what I told you at the beginning, and then they got in the car and drove away without coming inside. Frank shook my hand. "You have 2 years before this either works or it doesn't," he said. "The next 24 months are the only ones that matter. Go to work." I went to work. Here is what nobody tells you about the early days of building something from nothing. The loneliness of it is the hardest part. Not the hours. Not the money stress. Not the days when the fuel delivery is late or the card reader goes down or a supplier short ships you and you spend 4 hours on hold trying to get a credit. Those things are hard, but they are problems you can solve. The loneliness is different. It is the specific ache of doing something enormous in a room where nobody is watching, where your wins are invisible and your losses are terrifying and there is no applause and no sympathy and no one to tell you whether you are doing it right. I opened Red Cedar Fuel and Convenience on a Wednesday morning in April with a hand-lettered sign, a fully stocked cooler, an ice machine that actually worked, and a pit in my stomach the size of the loan I had just taken on. The first week was slow. The second week was slower. I called Frank every Sunday and read him my numbers and he asked questions that told me which ones I needed to fix. He never said it was going to be fine. He said, "Here's what the number is telling you, and here's what you should do about it." By the end of the second month, the regulars started appearing. This is the thing about a gas station that is run with genuine care in a location that has been neglected. People notice fast, not dramatically. They come in for coffee and the coffee is hot and fresh and the person behind the counter knows their name by the fourth visit. They come in for a lottery ticket and the display is current and the transaction is fast and clean. They come back. They tell someone. The someone comes. My mother called at the end of month 3, not to check in, to relay a message from my father. He wanted to know how the business was going, not asked directly. Through her. I told her it was going. She asked what that meant. I told her it meant the numbers were moving in the right direction and that I would have a clearer picture at the 6-month mark. She said, "Your father Connor worries. I said I knew he did. She said, Connor thinks the location is going to have a highway bypass problem in a few years. He read something about a proposed road project. I had read the same article. The proposed bypass was 22 miles south of my location and had been in planning stages for 11 years with no approved funding. I told her this. She said, he just thought you should know. I said thank you. I went back to work. Here's what I want to ask you. Have you ever been in the middle of building something real, something that required everything you had, and had someone send you worry disguised as information? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do, because the part of this story that surprised even me is coming, and I do not want you to miss it. By month 6, the numbers were not just moving in the right direction. They were moving faster than Frank's conservative projections. The coffee program was outperforming everything. I had partnered with a local bakery for fresh pastries every morning, the kind of thing a chain store cannot do and a neglected independent never bothers with. The fuel margins were thin the way fuel margins always are, but the in-store conversion rate, the percentage of fuel customers who also came inside, was nearly double what the previous owner had managed. Frank came out in October and walked the store with me. He checked everything the way he always did, systematic and unhurried, and then he sat in my small back office and looked at the 6-month numbers and said, you are ahead of where I expected you to be. I asked by how much. He said, enough that I want you to start thinking about what comes next. What came next was the adjacent lot. The property on the east side of my station had been sitting empty for 3 years, owned by a man named Gerald Briggs, no relation to my old boss, who had been holding it with vague intentions that had never materialized. Frank had identified it before I even signed my papers. He told me then to watch it, to get to know the owner, to be patient, and to have a plan ready when the moment arrived. The moment arrived in November of my first year when Gerald Briggs's wife called him from a retirement community in Florida and told him it was time to stop managing property from a distance. He sold it to me for considerably less than he could have gotten from a developer because I had spent 4 months stopping by his house every few weeks with a cup of coffee and a genuine interest in what he planned to do with his retirement. Relationships are the cheapest currency in business and the only one that compounds. I built a small car wash on that lot. Nothing fancy. 2 bays, well maintained, priced fairly. It opened in the spring of my second year and within 3 months was contributing a margin that changed the conversation about what this business was. The first time my numbers crossed into something that could be called genuinely profitable, I sat alone in my office after close and did not feel what I expected to feel. I expected relief. I expected vindication. I expected some version of the feeling you imagine you will have when the thing you bet everything on proves itself real. What I felt instead was very quiet and very certain. Certain not about the money, though the money was real and growing in mine. Certain about the decision I had made in that parking lot on a March morning when my father told me I was going to lose everything. Certain that the version of me who had signed those papers had been right, not because the outcome proved it, but because the work had been sound from the beginning and the work was what had always mattered. I drove home that night past the house where I had grown up. I did not stop. I did not call anyone. I just noted the lights in the windows and kept driving toward my own. Some reckonings do not require an audience. Some of them are just yours. The second year of running Red Cedar Fuel and Convenience taught me 3 things that no business school would have had the patience to explain. The first was that every system you build will be tested by the worst possible version of the circumstances you built it for. In my second year, that test arrived in the form of a fuel supplier who went into receivership in the middle of a delivery cycle, a 3-week stretch in July where the air conditioning failed during a heat index that kept the temperature above 100 degrees for 11 straight days, and a theft incident that cost me $4,000 and 2 weeks of sleep before I figured out where the leak was. I handled all 3, not gracefully, not without cost, but I handled them, which is a different kind of proof than success. Success tells you the conditions were right. Handling failure tells you the foundation is real. The second thing I learned was that the business you open is never the business you end up running. Red Cedar started as a gas station with a convenience component and a car wash. By the end of year 2, the bakery partnership had expanded into a small hot food program that ran from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. The coffee program had become the primary reason a third of my regular customers stopped in. I had added a propane exchange, a key-cutting service, and a UPS drop-off partnership that brought in foot traffic I had not anticipated and could not have planned for. Each of these things started as a small decision that compounded. Each one was invisible to anyone who was not watching closely. Each one made the business more resilient and more profitable and harder to replicate. Frank visited quarterly and asked questions and drank black coffee and never once said I told you so, which was the most valuable thing he could have done because it kept the focus where it belonged. On the next quarter, not the last one. The third thing I learned in that second year was about my family. Not from a conversation, from the absence of one. My Aunt Vera called. My parents did not. Connor did not. In 2 years of building something real. I had received no phone call asking how it was going, no drop-in visit to see what the place looked like now, no acknowledgement that the numbers they had assumed would be catastrophic had not been catastrophic at all. Derek came by on a Saturday morning in my second fall and sat at the small counter I had added near the coffee station and drank a large drip coffee and looked around the store with the specific eyes of someone who has run something themselves. She did not say anything dramatic. She just said, "This is good work, Maya. Your grandfather would have liked this place." My grandfather on my mother's side had run a small engine repair shop for 40 years. He died before I was old enough to remember the shop, but there was a photograph of him at his workbench that had sat on Vera's dresser my entire childhood. A man in a work apron, unhurried, doing the thing he understood. I had looked at that photograph 100 times without knowing why it mattered to me until the morning I turned the key in my own front door for the first time. Vera's visit was the only family visit in 2 years. I had stopped counting after the first 6 months, but I noticed the absence the way you notice a sound that has stopped. Not with grief, with information. The letter from my brother arrived in month 26. Not a phone call. A letter, which told me something about how confident he was in what he was saying, because people who are uncertain make phone calls where they can adjust to the other person's response. People who have decided write letters. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph was a compliment, the Connor version of one, which acknowledged that the business appeared to be doing adequately. The second paragraph was a pivot. He had been talking to my parents, he wrote, about their retirement situation. My father's pension was less than they had planned. The cost of living had increased. They were in a position where some additional support would be meaningful. The third paragraph was the ask, framed as an observation. He noted that I had done well, that the business had been built in part on the foundation of a family that had supported and believed in me, and that there was an opportunity for us to discuss how that support might be acknowledged going forward in a practical way. Built on the foundation of a family that had supported and believed in me. I read that sentence 4 times. I want you to read it too, because it is a masterpiece of a particular kind of rewriting. The family that had stood in the parking lot on the day I signed my papers and told me I was going to lose everything had, somewhere in 26 months, become the foundation that had supported and believed in me. I set the letter on my desk. I did not respond immediately. I had learned from Frank that the first response you feel is almost never the right one, and the right response almost always requires sitting with the situation long enough for clarity to replace emotion. What I felt first was anger, sharp and specific, not at the audacity of the ask, though the audacity was remarkable, at the revision, at the quiet, confident erasure of what had actually happened. My father's voice on that March morning. "Do not come crying to us." My brother's flat assessment. "That is what people say when they overpay for a problem." What I felt after the anger settled, which took several days, was something I had not expected. A kind of tired clarity. The anger burned off and left behind a clean, cold understanding. They had done the math. I had built something real. And they had recalculated their position the way people always do when the odds change. It was not personal. That was the thing I kept arriving at. It was not personal in the way a betrayal is personal. It was simply the behavior of people who had looked at a situation, assessed it in terms of their own interest, arrived at a conclusion, and acted on it. My father had done the same thing in that parking lot. He had assessed the situation in terms of what he believed to be true, arrived at a conclusion, and said it plainly. The conclusion had been wrong, but the process was the same. I did not owe them my anger any more than I owed them a share. Frank came by the week I received the letter. I showed it to him. He read it once. He set it down. He picked up his coffee. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" I told him I did not know yet. He said, "You do not have to decide today what your relationship with your family looks like, but you do have to decide what you believe you owe them. And that is a different question than what you feel." He was right. It was a different question. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I thought about it while I opened the store at 5:30 and while I reconciled the till at close and while I drove the route I drove every morning past the house I had grown up in without stopping. And I arrived at an answer that surprised me with how simple it was. I did not owe my family a share of what I had built. Not because I was angry. Not because of the parking lot and the words my father had used and the letter I had not sent in response, but because the business had not been built on their support. It had been built on 6 years of savings, 3 months of Frank's mentorship, $41,000 and a loan I had serviced alone, and 26 months of 7-day weeks and Sunday phone calls with a retired businessman who had believed in me without being asked to. That was what the business was built on. Not on a family that had stood in a parking lot and told me I was going to fail. What I did owe them, I thought, was honesty. Not revenge. Not a public accounting. Just honesty, said plainly, in a room without an audience. I called my father, not my brother, my father, directly, because some conversations should not be routed through someone else. He answered in the voice he used when he expected something difficult. It was the same voice he had used when I was 17 and had done something that required a conversation, formal and braced. I told him I had received Connor's Connor's letter. I told him I understood the situation he had described. I told him I was sorry he was in a difficult place with the retirement income and that I genuinely wished it were otherwise. Then I told him the truth. I said, I would like to help you and Mom in whatever way I am able, as your daughter, because you are my parents and I love you. But I want to be honest with you about something first. He said nothing. He was listening. I said, on the morning I bought that building, you told me I was going to lose everything and that when I did I should not come crying to you. I understand why you said it. You were afraid for me and you said the thing fear says when it has run out of other words. I do not hold it against you. But I need you to know that what I built without your support. And what I choose to give going forward, I will give from love, not from an accounting of what was owed. The silence that followed was the longest I had heard from my father since the one after I told him I was dropping out of business school. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Not dramatically. It was still the same careful voice, but something in it had come loose from the frame it usually sat in. He said, I know what I said that morning. I said, I know you do. He said, I was wrong. 3 words. The same number Roy used. The same weight. He did not say it easily. My father was not a man who said things like that easily, and I knew it, and the knowing made the 3 words land harder than any longer sentence would have. He said them and then he was quiet again, and I let the quiet be, because some things need room. I told him I was glad he said it. I meant it. We talked for 20 more minutes. Not about the money, about other things. About my mother's garden, which had apparently become her full occupation since she retired from the dental office. About a neighbor on their street whose dog had gotten into the trash for the 3rd time in a week. About nothing important. About everything that had been sitting on a shelf between us for 2 years waiting for someone to take it down. When I hung up, I sat in my car in the parking lot of my own business and looked at the sign I had put up on the first day, and I felt, for the first time since that March morning, that the story had reached a place where it was ready to be told. Connor and I had a different conversation, shorter, in a coffee shop 2 weeks later. He arrived prepared to negotiate. I arrived prepared to be honest. The negotiation did not happen because I did not participate in it. I told him what I had told my father, in fewer words, and I told him that the letter he had written had rewritten history in a way I was not going to pretend had not happened. He said I was being uncharitable. I said I was being accurate. He said the family had been there for me in ways I did not acknowledge. I asked him to name one. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, we worried about you. I said, I know, but worry is not the same as showing up. We finished our coffee. We left the coffee shop. We are not close. We are not estranged. We exist at a careful distance that is more honest than the performance of closeness we never actually had. My mother came to the store for the first time 8 months after the phone call with my father. She did not call ahead. She just appeared one Thursday morning in a coat I had not seen before, holding a small plant in a plastic pot, the kind from the garden center at the hardware store. A succulent. Because they do not need much water, she said, setting it on the counter, and they do not die easy. I looked at the plant. I looked at my mother. She was not a woman who explained herself, and she was not explaining herself now. She was standing in my store in her coat with a succulent and a face that was trying to be ordinary and not quite managing it. I put the succulent on the windowsill by the coffee station where it gets the morning light. It is still there. It has grown considerably. My mother stayed for an hour. She asked me to show her how the coffee program worked and I showed her. She asked about the bakery partnership and I explained it. She walked around the store with the same eyes Vera had used. Not quite the same, because Vera had run something herself and my mother had not, but trying. Looking at what I had made the way you look at something you almost lost the chance to see. Before she left she held my hand for a moment at the door. She did not say anything. I did not need her to. Some repairs do not require words. They require presence. And she had finally shown up. Frank retired from consulting entirely the spring of my 4th year. His health had been declining quietly in the way he did everything, without making a fuss about it, and he decided he wanted his remaining time for other things. He came to the store one last time on a Tuesday morning and we sat in my back office with coffee and he gave me the thing he had been giving me for 4 years, which was his full attention and his honest assessment. He said the business was sound. He said the decisions I had made in the 2nd and 3rd years had created a level of diversification that made the operation significantly more resilient than when I had started. He said the food program was underperforming its potential and that if I ever wanted to take it seriously it would require a dedicated hire. He said the car wash bays needed their equipment evaluated in the next 12 months. Then he said something he had never said before. He said, I have worked with a lot of people over the years, Maya. Most of them needed me longer than they thought they would. You needed me less than you thought you would. The work was always yours. I just handed you the vocabulary for it. I told him the vocabulary had been the whole thing. He shook his head. No, he said. The vocabulary just names what is already there. What is already there is what matters. And what was already there in you was there before you ever walked into that diner. He finished his coffee. He shook my hand. He walked out the front door and got into his car and drove away. I watched from the window until until his car turned onto Route 9 and disappeared in the direction of whatever he was going to do with the rest of his time. I stood at that window for a while. The morning traffic moved past the pumps. A regular came in for her coffee, the tall one with oat milk and 2 sugars, and I had it ready before she reached the counter because I have had it ready every morning for 3 years. She said good morning. I said good morning. She took her coffee and left. The ordinary unremarkable rhythm of a place where someone shows up every day and does the work with care. That is what I had built. Not a monument. Not a story about beating the odds, though I had beaten them. A place where people came because it was run well, because the coffee was hot and the ice machine worked and the person behind the counter knew their order. A place built on 6 years of savings and 3 months of mentorship and 26 months of 7-day weeks and then more years of the same, compounding quietly into something that would outlast the fear my father had felt in a parking lot on a March morning. I bought a second location in my 5th year. A struggling station on the north end of town with the same patterns I had recognized on Route 9. Undermanaged, underinvested, the kind of place that only needs someone who sees what it could be and is willing to do the work. My father came to the opening, not with a speech, not with an apology packaged for an audience. He came alone on a Thursday morning and walked through the store the way he used to walk through everything, steady and observant. And when he came out he stood beside me in the parking lot and looked at the sign. "You did this," he said. I said, "Yes." He nodded, said nothing else, but he stayed for an hour, which from Leonard Sutton was a declaration. My mother sent a plant for the new location. A succulent, of course. I put it in the window by the coffee station where it would get the morning light. I have 3 locations now. A 4th under negotiation. 17 employees. A food program that does what Frank said it could if I took it seriously, because I eventually hired the dedicated person he said it required. A woman named Tasha who had been running a food truck for 4 years and knew exactly what she was doing. Aunt Vera comes by every few months and sits at the coffee counter and drinks a large drip and looks around the store with those eyes. She does not say much. She does not need to. She is the reason I knew Frank existed. She is the reason I had a vocabulary for what I was trying to do before Frank gave me the business vocabulary. She is the reason I understood that a woman building something is not a story that requires an apology. The succulent on the windowsill at the original location is enormous now. My mother comes in once a month and waters it herself, which I pretend not to notice because it makes her feel useful, and it is genuinely the healthiest plant I have ever owned. Connor and I have coffee twice a year. It is not warm. It is honest, which at this point I prefer. My father calls on the first Sunday of every month. He asks about the business with genuine interest now, not the braced interest of a man waiting for bad news, but the real kind. He asks specific questions. He remembers what I told him the month before. Once, recently, he asked what I was looking at for the 4th location and I told him about the numbers and the neighborhood and the traffic patterns and he listened for 20 minutes without saying anything except yes and go on and what does Frank think, and I had to tell him Frank was retired now, and he said, well then what do you think, and I told him what I thought, and he said, that sounds right to me. That sounds right to me. From Leonard Sutton, a man who had spent 31 years in a warehouse telling himself that reaching past what your hands could hold was a lesson that ended badly, that was everything. I drive past the original location every morning. I have driven past it every morning for 5 years. The sign is the same one I put up on the first day, repainted once, still the same design. The ice machine has been replaced twice. The coffee program runs itself now, which is what a good system does eventually. Every time I pull into that parking lot I think about the morning I stood there with a cashier's check and my father's voice in my ear telling me I was going to lose everything. I did not lose everything. I built something. With 6 years of savings and a borrowed vocabulary and a retired businessman who drank black coffee and asked the right questions and never once said the words good luck because he understood that luck had very little to do with it. I built something and it grew and it keeps growing and it is mine. And on the first Sunday of every month the man who stood in that parking lot and said the thing fear says when it has run out of other words calls me and asks how it is going.